Hi, everybody, and welcome to IABC's Circle of Fellows. This is our monthly panel discussion around a topic of interest to communicators, and I am joined by a wonderful panel of IABC Fellows to discuss ethics. This is Ethics Month in IABC World. Couldn't come at a better time, given everything that's going on in the world, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. Before we jump into that, and in fact, before we even jump into introductions, I do want to make a quick announcement. I know that everybody on the panel is aware of this, but it hasn't, well, it has been announced insofar as the agenda for the IABC World Conference in Vancouver in June has been posted, but we haven't said anything, and that is that the June episode of Circle of Fellows is going to be held live and in person as a session at the World Conference. We're still working through the theme and the panelists. It will be streamed in real time, so those of you who like to watch us live on YouTube will still be able to do that and to be able to contribute your questions and comments and observations. The date and time are in the agenda. I didn't look it up before we started here today, but we'll be making plenty of announcements. And if you're planning on attending the IABC World Conference, plan to stop by that session. It should be a good, interesting one. Looking for a lot more audience participation from that one. So let's jump into our panel today, talking about ethics in communications. And I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves clockwise as I see you, starting with you, Diane.
Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Gajewski, coming to you from beautiful Ithaca, New York, in upstate Finger Lakes region. I'm a professor of strategic communication at Ithaca College, and I practice what I preach through Gajewski Analytics.
Great to have you with us 2 months in a row, Diane. And Carolyn.
Hello, everyone. I'm Caroline Sepriel. I'm dialing in here from Belgium. I've been a specialist in crisis management and communication my entire career, which is coming up to more than 30 years now, working around the world for multinational clients across industry sectors. And I have my own company, CSNA International, since 1991. Delivering this services to clients, and I've been a member of IABC since 1987 and a founding member of the IABC Ethics Committee. It's a pleasure to be here.
Very glad to have you here, and your background and experience with the Ethics Committee should come in handy today. Jane.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Mitchell, live in the UK. I've been, I guess my daily work life helps organizations think about their leadership and embedding of ethics and values into the reality of behaviors and decision making. My involvement with IABC stretches back to a long time ago, when I was involved with the UK chapter. I was on the ethics task force that recreated the way that we looked at ethics at IABC, and I'm currently chair of the Fellows Committee. And there's been all sorts in between, including World Conference, and so it's extremely exciting that we have a live circle at IABC World Conference.
And of course, we will be welcoming our new fellows. The 2025 class will be welcoming at the conference too. Good to have you here, Jane. Tosh.
Hello, everyone. I'm Todd Tosh Hattori, and I am calling in from Seattle, Washington, where I work for F5 Incorporated. We are all about data security, and I have served in IABC, many capacities within IABC, including World Chair, as well as serving as the Ethics Chair for 2 terms. So great to be here with this distinguished panel.
Great to have you here too. And as long as we're looking to the past, I'll note that I've been a member of IABC since 1977.
Oh, wow.
That's right. I got my first corporate communications job. My boss was very active. In fact, he's a fellow, Dave Orman. And he said, if you're working for me, you're going to belong to IABC. I said, who pays the dues? He said, we do. I said, then I don't care. Little did I know where that all would lead. So let's talk ethics. And I want to start by acknowledging that the public relations industry has a problem with ethics in terms of the way we are perceived by the public. We are portrayed in movies and TV and literature as a wildly unethical group that will do whatever is necessary to produce a positive outcome on behalf of our client. And there's an example of this in the news recently that's gotten a lot of attention, and I don't think it has done anything except reinforce this perception. This is a PR agency that represented the actor-director Justin Baldoni in his conflict with the actress Blake Lively after they filmed a movie together. This agency has been accused of engaging in several unethical behaviors as part of a smear campaign against Blake Lively. These were in retaliations for her complaints about sexual harassment and workplace misconduct during the production of the film. They have been accused of planting negative media narratives, astroturfing, digital manipulation, coordinated retaliatory strategies, and exploiting media ethics, working with online fixers to create and boost content aimed at damaging Ms. Lively's reputation while suppressing negative information about Baldoni. She has claimed that all this has produced emotional distress and professional harm. And this has all been in the news, and I wonder what we do as a profession dominated in a lot of cases by agencies in order to counter this narrative, which has been so prominent for so long.
Mm.
We're our own worst example of the shoemaker's children having no shoes, right? We don't know how to manage our own reputation. I talk to my students about this a lot. I'm invited every year into our Intro to Strategic Communication class to deliver the lecture on ethics. And I tell the students that it starts with them really as the core of a new cohort to sort of redefine what our profession is about. And I leave them with this message of, are we pushers or prescribers? And I think very often we are put in the position of having to take on jobs or assignments that we might feel are a little bit sketchy. And I caution my students that it's perfectly okay to fire a client and to decline an opportunity if you feel that something is unethical. And there are two kinds of people who provide drugs, and one are physicians or other healthcare professionals who are trained and licensed and who will only prescribe something when it's in your best interest. And then there are pushers who will give you anything if you have the money. And it's up to them to stand firm. But how we communicate that publicly is going to take a while.
Mm.
Any other thoughts? I mean, one of the things that I keep thinking is that there are a few countries internationally that require public relations practitioners to be certified, licensed in order to practice. In the US, there are a number of professions that require this: law, medicine, accounting, I mean, even wastewater engineers, because I once went and I did some consulting with the association that certifies them. And I was thinking that, you know, if you were required to be certified in order to practice in the US or in the UK, wherever, then you would be bound to comply with the code of ethics that's bound up in that certification, and you could be bounced out of the profession if you were found to have violated that. Is that a practical thought?
I think it's a practical thought, but the reality is that the profession is not regulated. So how are you going to comply something? We have the same thing in crisis management. How are you going to ensure to certify people in a profession that is not regulated, has no oversight? I mean, if I make the analogy with crisis communication or crisis management, emergency response is regulated, business continuity is regulated, etc., etc. Crisis management, if you mess up your crisis, nobody's going to make you pay a fine. So I think it is closely connected with what level of oversight do we have on the profession in order for the certification to have any meaning.
I think every year when you renew your membership with IABC, you're asked to review and commit to the IABC Code of Ethics. So I think that's a really important step for our members at minimum. A few years back, when I was brought back into the Ethics Committee, we started to talk about the importance of some type of power of the Ethics Committee with the approval of the Executive Board when members are situations are brought to the attention of the Ethics Committee, that we could make a recommendation on removing membership and actually bringing to the attention of others unethical behaviors or practices. And so was very excited that discussion started when I was brought back into the Ethics Committee and continued once I rolled off of the Ethics Committee. And so now we have some very well-defined processes on how we investigate and make recommendations to the Executive Board to remove membership, to revoke accreditation of our members who are found to be in violation of the IABC Code of Ethics.
Okay. I am really interested in the way this conversation has gone, and I'll do it in reverse order, I think. With Todd, the thing, and this isn't a criticism, it's an observation. And when we renew our membership, we are asked to say that we've taken a look at the Code of Ethics, and therefore, and when we've ticked the box, we can then move forward. We don't actually have to look at the Code of Ethics. And that makes me think about many organizations who do exactly the same with their workforce, with their staff, with their people, with their teams. They write great words, and yet the actions don't necessarily deliver, which takes me through to Caroline, which is, how do you regulate within an organization, within an association, that you have made a commitment, apparently, to a code or whatever it might be called, within an organization or within an association, and yet we're not regulated, monitored, evaluated to assess? It is virtually impossible, isn't it? With all of the work that all the members of IABC do, how do you monitor that unless you are referred back, as Todd says, back to the Ethics Committee? And then if I go back to Diane with that great analogy of pushers and prescribers, when you were describing the story, Shell, which I'm not familiar with, I think it's kind of been there in the ether, but it's not mainstream in the UK. But when you were telling that story, and then Diane picked up on it, what I was thinking of, behind all of this pushing of whatever the information is, whether it's false or whatever, there will be lawyers who are regulated, but they're not communicating what's being communicated by his lawyers. I can't even remember his name now. But there will be a whole group of people that are colluding in all of this. And where do you stand as a communicator in an agency when you have a high-profile client with a big ego and a big charisma, and you have a very expensive lawyer's firm who is guiding for the best interest of in the best interest of their client, and they are doing what is legal, but the communicator is stuck right in the middle. And I think very often, to the point that Caroline was making, as communicators in an organization, you are stuck in amongst all of this maelstrom of, this is what we say we do with our code. We have a really charismatic, ego-driven boss. How on earth am I going to say no to him? Am I doing anything illegal? No. And the pressures are immense. And then at the same time, you've got public opinion, which, as we know, and we've been talking about at IABC for years and years, and it's just become a crescendo now. We've got false information everywhere. So I think my answer to your question, Shel, is it ain't easy. It is unbelievably difficult. And how you balance that, I think, is the conundrum that we face virtually every day.
I'd like to add, if that's okay, that I think if we talk about agencies, what's the track record of agencies firing clients because they're being asked to do something that's unethical, borderline even illegal? When you do that in-house and you have an ethical problem or a break of business principles, you have a whistleblowing and a sort of reporting hotline where you can take action without being caught. In an agency, it's impossible. I always thought that I'm not going to work for another agency again because of that. And when I work on my own, I'll be able to make my own decision. And actually, as a matter of fact, the first year I was in business in 91, I fired a major client because of the way they behaved. And I never went back. And the repercussions were quite significant. So it's down, unfortunately, too much to individuals and not agency staff not having clear guidelines from their bosses as to what is the power. And I think agencies have even less guidelines than in-house practitioners.
I did want to mention that those of you who are watching live are welcome to join the conversation. You're using YouTube. There's a comment feature, and if you use it, I'll see it, and I'll be able to share it with the panelists, and you can ask your questions, share your observations, what have you. It's an interesting time to be talking about ethics, because if you look at what's going on around the world, ethics seems to have been devalued. There are a lot of people in prominent positions all over the world who are behaving in unethical behavior and shrugging it off, or even maybe expressing some pride in it. How do you convince clients, leaders, others that we are representing and working with not to jump into that pool and to continue to behave ethically? What's the case for ethical behavior in a world that seems to be spinning out of ethical control?
I think you need a license to operate, and that doesn't mean the actual paper. It means that, I see it again from my perspective, reputation at the end of the day is granted to you. So you don't behave, the public distrusts you, and you lose your reputation. A lot of the worst crises today is not because you have an accident, it's because of the way you handle the accident. Or it's not because something goes wrong in your organization. We always make the distinction between the level of attribution of responsibility in a crisis and the way it is handled. Well, you could be extremely guilty and have a very high level of attribution and responsibility, but a simple basic principle as like owning up and then handling it properly is what's going to save the trust of your stakeholders, even in the face of the most acute, or in the face of crises that are being caused by unethical behavior. And owning up is the first step. And then typically, unless it's a repeated offense, you get a second chance. So at the end of the day, reputation's on the line. Reputation you don't buy, as you all know. You granted reputation. It is your unspoken license to operate.
I guess I would have.
Tosh, why don't you go ahead?
I think a really important part of helping your company, your employees, and also your customers and audiences understand what is communication ethics. I think that the whole idea behind IABC's Ethics Month is to increase awareness that we actually do have a defined policy around communication ethics and define what communication ethics are. I think a big challenge is that when you deal with companies that are facing a crisis or in a situation where they're having to make decisions and you've not talked about what communication ethics for the organization is prior, then people are making decisions that are not well informed. And so having the conversation early, educating all employees, having policies defined. When I was ethics chair, we talked about ethics is the last thing that people want to talk about because they're afraid that they really don't know what it is, or that they may be perceived, if they're entertaining the conversation, they may be perceived as not being ethical. And so that's why they're raising the question. So committing to having those conversations early, before there's a crisis, before there's a need for an ethical decision, is really important within organizations.
Diane?
Yeah, I guess I'd get back to what Tosh was talking about. I am unaware of how many cases have actually been brought to an IABC ethics board. I know that the policies exist and the procedures are developed. But I guess I contrast that to the advertising industry. One of my colleagues at Ithaca College, a professor in advertising, is part of the Advertising Review Board, and he occasionally is called in for multi-day, multi-week hearings when someone brings an ad up for review that someone feels is unethical. And that actually gets out into the press, not only within the advertising industry, but I think the public is aware of that. And I'm not sure in our field whether these kind of hearings or deliberations are kept private or if we do make some publicity around it. And I think until, unfortunately, we have a few examples in our field of something being brought to some board of ethical standards and does have some kind of penalty, maybe being removed from IABC or something else. I don't think people are going to think that this has any teeth or not even aware that it exists.
Yeah, interestingly, the case that I remember was not with IABC, it was PRSA. It was actually the volunteer president of PRSA who had been determined to have engaged in some insider trading, I believe it was. It was a Securities and Exchange Commission violation in any case, and he was stripped of his membership in PRSA. I think that was in maybe the late 70s or the early 80s. So, I mean, that's why it stands out in my mind. It's the only one I think I've ever heard of. But we do have I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish.
We have a comment from Deb Heilman, my colleague on the Global Communication Certification Council. My firm, Institute for Crisis Management, requires our consultants to make a commitment in writing to ethical practices that parallels the IABC code.
That's great.
Which, yeah, I think that is probably a practice some other leaders of agencies would want to mirror.
I was going to
think
your comment, Shell. I think this brings up the point that should we be only talking about ethical communications or ethical behavior, of which communication is one bit? By trying to make a distinction, yes, we are the communications profession. By just focusing on ethical communication, I think we're missing a lot of the unethical behavior that's out there. So,
Jane?
Yeah, to your original question, I think that Caroline's words ring very true, is that license to operate. and what everybody else supported that. But I do believe that you make a choice. And excuse me, the cat has just decided to join the webcast. Sorry. I think you make a choice, and it's as if we, to the points you're all making. If we were having a conversation within an organisation related to a difficult decision, a dilemma that we would have to make, do you make you can only decide with the consequences and the balance of a number of influences on your decision. It's never a black and white decision if you have a dilemma that you face. And the dilemma could be about your own career and where you want to position yourself. So do you want to make it for the short term? You want to make a fast buck working in an organization where you've got, let's just say, apparent power as a comms leader. And you think, okay, I'm just going to go with the ride for a couple of years. That'll be fine. Or do you make it for the long term? And it's about your own reputation and your own brand and what you stand for. And that's a choice that you have to make. The trick, of course, is that it's not a legal requirement, mandatory, for anybody working in an organisation who's a communication professional to be a member of IABC. Well, of course, it should be, shouldn't it? Because then we might not even be having a conversation about ethics in communication, or there wouldn't be so many dilemmas for people to face. But I think it is a decision that you have to make. And of course, these are we're talking human beings. It is very difficult. There is no regulation that defines how you respond. There is your own ethical behaviour that you have to look to and what it is that you're trying to do now or for the future. It's a real dilemma.
Going back to our earlier discussion about the declining bar for ethics worldwide, one of the trends that we see, and this is supported by research, is that a growing number of people are getting their news from social media. And in fact, TikTok has become one of the primary sources of news for Gen Z. And even worse, at least in my judgment, they're getting their news from influencers rather than journalists. I mean, some of this is people who are just reading news on TikTok, but these are news influencers, which means that they could be getting their news from people of questionable ethics who have an agenda in what they're presenting and how they're presenting it. As communicators, how do we help our companies address this? The fact that they our audiences may be getting inaccurate or biased information around the topics that they're interested in that are relevant to the organization. How do we talk to those audiences about where to go get and why they should go get credible information?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I see it happening right now in higher ed, for example. There's so many questions about funding and maybe closing down a lot of sources of funding and research, also about immigration and the status of some of our students. And what I see happening, at least in the higher ed community, is a lot of informal kind of talking groups among faculty, administrators, perhaps inviting a specialist in around specific topics. Like we have something going on now about how to support and answer questions of our international students. And so I think having something that is quick and to the point with some experts, opportunity for dialogue, is really necessary right now. I think we can't take a lot of time to make some fancy program about it, but understanding where the questions are and just assembling some way that people can have a forum to get some accurate information and making that relevant to their job. What questions do they need to answer and who are they working with? I think that's an effective strategy.
Yeah, I think it was Jane who'd mentioned gaining your customer, your public's trust. And so particularly with those folks who are looking to social media, the research has all told us that they want to see transparency, they want to see authenticity. And so getting away from the corporate speak and the jargony language that doesn't make sense to the Gen Zers or the people who are looking to social media is critical. So again, establishing that we are a trusting or trustable organization. We deserve your trust, that we deserve your loyalty, has to happen early, and be consistent, persistent throughout all of your communications. We also know that the younger generations are now saying, "I value organizations that are committed to the community." That there is some social cause or social meaning that the organization is committed to. And then, there is that opportunity. Yes, there are influencers out there who are not reputable or are not honorable or ethical, but identifying influencers or establishing someone within your organization to become an influencer is an opportunity to tap into those audiences.
But I was going to say that at the root of it is I mean, I teach my student when I talk about this, I tell them, where do you get your news? And they say TikTok or whatever social media. And I say, why don't you, for instance, go to the source? And they say, no, because social media is free speech. And I think there's a major confusion between free speech and credible sources. And students and younger people are completely lost in their ability to have critical thinking. And that's where it starts, to try and make the difference between what is credible, what's not, what's ethical, what's not. It's lost. And so, of course, it's faster, it's easier to do it via social media. Why should I check it directly with the source? And there is a perception that certain media, and I'm not going to lump them all in this term, which I really don't like, called mainstream media, because I think there's a big difference between one mainstream media and the other. But if people are looking at the oversight, the vetting, the editorial standards to make information, put information out there that has been checked, that is obviously credible information. But a lot of the Gen Z don't even know how to make a difference because they've lost the sense of critical thinking. And I think, how can we expect people to behave ethically if they can't even recognize the difference between what's ethical, what's not, and what's real and what's not, what's a lie and what's not a lie?
I'm reminded, because it's very current here in the UK, of the behaviour of some large organisations that may well have, over the years, and if you look at Edelman over the last few years, there is less and less trust that exists with anybody who is in power, which includes journalists and reporters who at one time were at the top, which includes corporate organisations, business leaders, which at one time was at the top, and most recently, before they fell off the perch this year, and government leaders who have never been at the top. So with all of that, and with all these kind of bastions of power and big organizations outwardly treating people badly, there are big events that are happening. And in the UK here, what I am saying is just entirely public knowledge and acknowledged. We have an organization called the Post Office. And the Post Office scandal, as it's called, has been running and running. Now, that was brought to life in a drama. It was the drama after several decades, at least 2 decades, that brought to the public consciousness how this organization apparently had misbehaved towards, had treated its employees badly, who were employed by the Post Office. And with those big high profile, and there's lots of them around the world of those high profile cases, so trust has diminished. And I, for one, have worked, and Caroline, you can speak to this, work with organizations that feel that in a crisis, let's just say we need to make a third of our workforce redundant for whatever reason it might be, use language that obfuscates the reality of what's happening. And why do they do that? People, understandably, are very suspicious. What is the truth of the matter? And to Todd's point about using real language that resonates is something that actually resonates with people. If an organization is using real language, people sit up and say, wow, that's refreshing. I understand what that organization is saying. I understand the message. And actually, okay, they're making an effort. I'm not entirely sure that it's entirely what we need to hear, but at least they're making an effort. But I think for decades, organizations, people in power, journalists and reporters have used language that just hasn't resonated with the public mind. And of course, when you get social media, and that's exactly what it is just their language. So it's not a surprise that that's where they're turning. And I think that now all of these others are on the back foot and having to respond as opposed to being proactive and leading those messages.
Yeah, and the UK has got a great example of how to use language to get themselves out of a crisis. And I'm thinking of Kentucky Fried Chicken case of 2014. So here's an organization, 100% self-inflicted crisis. They decide to move from their own logistics partner to DHL that knocks on their door and gives them a much better offer. The day that they hand over, they have no backup and they haven't tested. So they cannot deliver chicken to 900 restaurants in the UK. Their business is chicken. They can't deliver chicken. So how do you get yourself out of that? You can waffle. You're never going to get out of that. And your customers are not going to come back to you. So they made a very, very brave decision. And I would say within the UK's culture of self-deprecating humor, which wouldn't work anywhere else, they got the approval of the lawyers and the leadership team to actually intervene the letters on the buckets. And instead of having KFC, they put FCK, and they saved the day. So it's one, owning up, and it's two, ethics of actually apologizing, saying we really messed up. And that's sounds like a basic, and they use very clever communication. They won an award at the Cannes International Advertising Awards, but they were allowed to do that by their leadership, who realized there was no other way out. They were also in a cultural environment where that would work, which is not the case everywhere else. But I think it's a fantastic example of a completely self-inflicted, highest level of attribution responsibility, and absolutely brilliant handling. The language was a reflection of their level of ownership to the crisis that they put themselves in. And they retained the trust of stakeholders.
Yeah.
There was another good example of that in the US, in New York, an investment company that was dragged through the media for some sexual misbehavior at a party. And the way they decided to deal with it was to become the poster child for treating women well and right in the workplace. They actually ended up being the organization that got the phone calls from the cable news stations when they needed a talking head to talk about it. They just said, we are going to remake ourselves in the ethical framework that we should have been practicing in the first place. We have an international panel here, so it's probably a great group to ask about the difference in ethics regionally. I mean, I think on some big topics, ethical behavior is ethical behavior, but on some levels, what is ethical and what is not varies from region to region. If you're a multinational communicator, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think they should be the same, but they're not. And there is a different set of values related to cultures, Western being generally based on Judeo-Christian values. And other people having different values. So I think there's certain things that would not work in other places. I think it's a fact that if you're multinational, you have to maneuver that very carefully. And I'm thinking of, one example that I thought was really interesting is the sanctions against Ukraine, where, the Yale, so-called Yale's list, which was started by this professor at Yale, which used PhDs who use substandards to measure, to make that list, criticized companies for not, pulling out of Russia instantly. And nobody even thought about the fact that most of these organizations have global HR policies that are supposed to be protecting people, and not, and some of them literally dumping thousands of employees in Russia against sanctions. And like Jane said, it's never black and white. It's always gray. And there's always, something that applies here that doesn't apply there. And so I remember calling this to attention to a Wall Street Journal reporter that asked me about this. What do you think of it? I said, it's normal that they take time. What, they're supposed to just work on the sanctions, fire everybody, close the operations, and that's good enough? Do have, a balancing act here. And so I definitely think it's a very tough one to walk, very tough one to walk. In some environments, the ethics perceptions are very different.
Yeah, and as a couple of you know, I'm teaching a course in global PR and asking for your help with this. Some of the things that I've encountered as a consultant are small things that are just in the course of doing business. So, for example, in Japan, it's considered normal to bring a small gift to a client, especially if you're visiting across countries. And in the United States, that can look like it's a bribe. And in fact, I remember doing some work with military organizations, and I quite literally could not go through a Starbucks drive-in and get them a cup of coffee because that was against their ethics policies. So there are little things in terms of intercultural communication, just in the way that we do business, that I think things may be interpreted in different kinds of ways. I don't know if any of you have some similar examples.
Well, I have an example that picks up on what you've both said. And also, I was really struck by what you said earlier, Caroline, about critical thinking being diminished these days because of the speed of social media and people responding. And I think that all added to that is also a less of a focus on critical conversations. And an example that I would add to build on what you've said, Diane, is about values. So within a code of ethics, launching, let's just say a company is launching a code of ethics within which there are a set of values, and pleased that they did consult with staff and employees to decide what those values should be. But the fact is that we can have a value in the UK or in Europe, which by and large is pretty much the same, although there are some differences. So let's just say respect is a value. Yes, we get that. In Asia, the interpretation of the word respect is very different, and it will manifest in very different ways. And it would be the same in the USA. So the critical conversation is the key for me, which is, don't assume that people understand as an author that what you have written is X. Assume that they probably think it's Y or Z or A squared or whatever it might be. So engage people in the critical conversation. And when you were talking before about having a clear statement of what ethics, communication ethics is, and I think it was you, Todd, who said that. But that won't be everything, that won't be the same to everybody in all cultures. And it is that conversation that will help to uncover that and uncork the conversation, and it makes it much more healthy and more generally understood, I would say.
Yeah.
To build on what Jane was just saying, I did work for a global organization as a consultant, and one of the things that I really admired about their helping all employees understand those the unique interpretations or practices around the world, was that they would actually publish documents so that their employees who were going into those countries, the different countries, understood the different business practices, what is and is not acceptable. While I was there, they realized, wow, we need to also inform our employees who aren't traveling, because as they interact with these folks in virtual meetings or in phone calls, they also need to be aware that there are certain things that you should and should not say, because even just the words is not just the behaviors need to be understood. So I think making the effort to document and help people increase their awareness and understanding of those differences is important.
I think language.
I think a highly relevant comment right now from Andrew Morrison, who's chair of the IABC Ethics Committee. In an organization, it is the culture of that organization which determines whether behavior is seen as ethical or not. Call it trial by peer group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But if we're communicators, I think language definitions, choice of word makes a difference. When I work with clients, I often ask them if they, through different questions, if they understand the difference between corruption and facilitation payments. And in some culture, they think there is a difference.
Yeah, I heard that in one organization I worked for is in this country, bribery is just the way things are.
Yeah, but then it's called bribery, and the leadership team say, no, we don't have bribery. Well, you have facilitation payments. Okay, well then that's like a gift. It's not the same. So you see, even that definition, a lot of people interpret it very differently. Mm-hmm. It's exactly the same. It's just a different word.
Carolyn, you specialize in crisis communication. What's the relationship between ethics and good and bad crisis handling?
Well, we have this wonderful data from the International Crisis Management Institute, and Deb Reese just a few minutes ago posted a question, which would indicate that half of the crises today, certainly I would say in the Western world, or I should say, no, not the Western world, the developed world, are actually smoldering, which means that they start with an issue that's neglected, ignored, shoved under the carpet, badly managed before they actually become a crisis. If 50% of crises today are smoldering, then that would indicate to me that it's not a safety problem necessarily, or if it is, it's this covering up of the safety problem that caused the crisis. It's behavior-based. And so I think it shows that more and more, because we're supposed to be safer in general as we are more developed, we have other crises that relate more to bad behavior and ethical issues. That's my take on it.
Other thoughts on crises? Because if not, we'll move on to the topic that we are required to address in every panel and every podcast episode these days. We'll be fined if we don't. And that's artificial intelligence.
Oh, wow.
We had the AI summit in Europe, and U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance basically signaled that the American policy on AI development is all pedal, no brake at this point. And I'm an enthusiastic advocate of the use of AI, and even I think that we need some brake. There's tremendous risk involved here. There's also the potential for unethical activities. So in the face of this rapid development, and it seems like there's a new model being released every week, what can we as communicators do to guide employees to reduce risk and encourage the responsible and ethical use of AI?
Yeah, This is going to be my canned answer for everything. Basically, it's starting the conversation within the organization. So making sure that you have clear policies. You've defined what is appropriate use and what is inappropriate use. Defining policy so that employees understand what the stance is of the organization. But then also making sure that you provide opportunity for dialogue. And so within the organization that I work for today, we have various AI discussion groups where we are looking at AI that the company has adopted, the methods by which we're using AI to advance our product development, and making sure that employees can participate in those conversations so they understand. I think we assume that everyone understands what AI is. We assume that everyone has tried it, but that's not true. And so making sure that we provide those venues within company time, people during their workday are able to participate in those conversations so that we have a shared understanding of what AI is and how we should be using it in the best interest of our customers. So maintaining that customer focus, but also maintaining a focus on how we are using AI to improve our employees' experience as well. So it's not only delivering great products enhanced by AI for our customers, but it's also how we are using AI internally to improve our employees' day-to-day experiences.
Mm. Mm.
It's also an emerging technology, which means that the ethical issues are emerging along with it. I read one post, I think it was on LinkedIn, that said you must disclose every time you have used AI. I think that's absurd. I used it once to distill a long bullet list, eliminate redundancy and categorize them. I still had to go through everything and make sure it was right and do some recategorization, and then I delivered that. It was an assignment to the executive who'd asked for it, and I didn't tell him I used AI. I wouldn't have told him I used Excel to crunch numbers either. My view is that you disclose when not disclosing runs the risk of deceiving or creating a misimpression. That's just one of the ethical issues that has emerged around AI. What are some of the other ethical issues that we're looking at?
In crisis management, the biggest problem is deep fakes. And every expert today will tell you that this year we are incapable, as of this year, of telling a deep fake. Impossible. The technology has advanced so much. So it goes back to what I said earlier. It's increasing and enhancing your employees' digital literacy. It's enhancing their critical thinking to stop, and instead of working 100 miles an hour, stop, check, verify, use digital. So AI is ahead on the deep fakes, but AI also has a number of tools that are designed to help you detect deep fakes. And so look at them, use them, put them in your system, get IT to vet them, so that, and then teach people to use this. So in crisis management, to me, that's the biggest one. Of course, there's ethical issues of AI associated with plagiarism and things like that, which have always existed even before that. But I think to me, that's where the biggest risk is. And we're only seeing the beginning.
Yeah, and that's not just video, that's audio as well. Jane?
Well, I was just thinking about the production of. So imagine you're in a situation, busy comms unit. You may just be one of two. There is a crisis, or there is a requirement to produce something yesterday. The time pressures never reduce. The numbers of people in communication department is reducing. And to Caroline's point, if you use AI, ChatGPT, Gemini, whatever it might be, any other, check that it makes sense, even though time is critical for you in this particular project, whatever it is. Don't just palm it off as your own, but use it to check in exactly the same way as you outlined at the beginning, Shell. I think that there is a risk that we've got a new shiny toy. It is still relatively new, although it is moving at pace. And that people say, great, I will get AI to do all of that stuff. It's a subject I don't know, I'll get AI to do it. And you get found out. I mean, it's lazy and you get found out. As many people, young people are finding when they are asking AI to do their CV or their biog. And of course, people are looking at it. And as Caroline says, pulling out and saying, okay, this is AI generated. Use it with care, but respect it because it's fantastically helpful. And I've done exactly the same as you, Shell. It was amazing for a bunch of focus groups that went on for hours and hours. And I had notes, put them all in, and it came out with themes and all sorts, which I then went back in and checked to make sure that it was absolutely accurate and the themes that were being represented were those that had been spoken. I think just treat it with respect.
I think a great way to connect use of AI and ethical practices is to, as Caroline had indicated, use those known use cases, write a scenario, and then get a group of people together in your company and read through it and say, how would you respond? So it's not only how do we identify those perhaps tricks in AI, but then how do we make the right decisions, the ethical decisions, based on how we think more critically about the scenario that's in front of us.
Yeah.
I think one of the other ethical issues around AI is around bias, because these models were trained on material that was biased. It internalizes all of those biases and produces outputs that reflect them. So reviewing what the outputs are that you have gotten from an AI chatbot to make sure that it does not contain that bias is important. Any other ethical issues?
Well, it's interesting on that point, Shell. I was going to say something. A couple of years back, as my model for AI as a crisis, as I train crisis team, I don't know if you guys remember the Star Trek Next Generation with the Data, which is obviously the android, the robot on the team, and the debates and the discussions that they have. And I always thought to myself, well, crisis teams under stress make decisions with their experience and their structure and their training and everything else, but there's always a degree of emotions and stress that's at play here. What if we had on the team an equivalent of Data that you'd literally shove stuff at, and he comes up with the most rational, unemotional type of feedback and input? And I put that together or to somebody, a professor in Australia, who said, you're right, absolutely. But to your point, Shell, whoever created that, artificial intelligence entity that would give you the input is still doing it according to certain bias and the way he was created.
Yeah.
So that's going to be forever the question, right?
Yeah. And Deb shares with us, just as with media and where we get news, which may be biased or downright wrong, we have to assume that the AI output may not be correct. And she adds, treat it with respect and a dose of skepticism. As someone once said, trust, but verify.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely.
I remember that. And that takes us to about the end of our discussion today. We only have about a minute and a half left, which is enough time for me to let everybody know about the March Circle of Fellows, which is scheduled for 4 p.m. Eastern Time, going back to Thursdays again, March 27th. The topic is one that I find really intriguing: working with data in communications. That's something we have not discussed on Circle of Fellows. We have a great panel to talk about that. Adrian Cropley, Robin McCasland, Letitia Narvaez, and Angela Sinicus. Angela Sinicus being the queen of measurement. So she works with data all the time. And by the way, Brian Kilgore, who joined us a little late, says, do American communicators recognize the decline in respect around the world for the USA? And we jumped a little bit into that earlier. And Deb says, Brian, sadly, many of us do. I want to thank the panel for your participation today. It has been wonderful, really good, rich, deep discussion. And of course, I want to thank Anna Willey, as always, for all of the work she does behind the scenes, putting these panels together, determining what the topic will be, and coordinating with everybody on times and dates. This would not happen without Anna's work. So we're very grateful. So until next month, thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Very nice
Bye.
seeing everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.